Hi everyone, this is Rosie, and today we are going to be sewing a trifold wallet with Cordura fabric. So let's get started. Let's take a quick look at the wallet. It is made with Cordura fabric, but you can use waterproof canvas if you prefer. When we open it up, you'll see 3 card slots on each side of the wallet with an ID window in the middle. There is also a generous billfold on the interior. This is meant to be a very beginner-friendly project with just straight seams, no zippers, and no closures. The exterior of the wallet is slightly wider than the interior, and that will ensure that the wallet closes properly and lays flat, even though there are no closures. To get the wallet to lay flat, all you will need to do is place a heavy book on top of it when you're done sewing, and the fabric will train itself to stay closed. If you would like to sew along with me, I will provide a link to the project worksheet in the description below the video. Now let's take a look at the materials that we will be using. I have all of my pieces cut out and ready to sew. You can refer to your project worksheet for the pieces that you need to cut and the sizes that you need to cut them at. For the wallet, I'm using classic Cordura fabric 1000 denier, and I will put a link in the description below the video to where I purchased this fabric. For the lining, I am using a 100% polyester anti-static fabric, and this is just a regular lining fabric that you would use in a garment. You can also use a ripstop nylon fabric. It works well in the wallet, but it does fray quite a bit. And for the ID window, I have my piece of plastic here, and it is a 16 gauge clear vinyl. We're going to start by working with the exterior of the wallet. So I'm just going to move these pieces here aside. And this is the exterior. It's the piece that measures 6.5 inches high by 12.25 inches wide. I want you to turn it over to the wrong side, and we're going to make some markings. Use your ruler and mark 3/8 of an inch in from each edge. So you'll just place your ruler down on the 3/8 inch mark and then draw your line. And you want to do this on each side. I have already marked all of mine. After drawing in your lines, you're going to see that a little box is formed on each of the 4 corners where the vertical and horizontal lines meet. So we want to take our scissors and we're going to cut out the box, but we're only going to do this on one side of the wallet. So just cut that out. And you're only going to do this on one side. I'm only going to do it along the longer side of the wallet. So now you have the exterior of the wallet with the boxes cut out just on one side. Next, take your lining piece that measures 4 3/8 inches high by 12.25 inches wide, and we're going to clip this to the right side of our exterior piece. So I have it wrong side facing up. I'm just going to flip it so that it's right side facing up. And I want to clip this to the top edge that does not have the boxes cut out. So go ahead and line everything up and clip the pieces together. And after clipping together, we're going to sew straight across with a 3/8 inch seam. I'm sewing on a Juki TL 2010Q, and I am using a stitch length of 3.0, and my seam allowance is 3/8 of an inch. You want to back stitch at both ends and just sew straight across that seam. And I am using a contrasting thread here just to help you see the seam line a little better. after you have that seam sewn, you're going to open this up. You want the seam pointing up towards the lining, and then we're going to flip this over to the right side, and we're going to stitch 1/8 of an inch away from that seam line on top of the lining. And for this I will still use a stitch length of 3.0 and backstitch at both ends. I am using a narrow zipper foot here, and the distance between my needle and the edge of the foot is approximately 1/8 of an inch. Now we can clip the lining and the exterior right sides together. When you clip, the bottom edge of the lining should be in line with the top of the square that we cut out right here. So line those up and then put in a clip, and then you'll clip along that side edge all the way up to the top. And then you'll do the same thing on this side. The bottom of the lining should be in line with the top edge of the square that we cut out. So if you look at it this way, the bottom of the lining will stop 3/8 of an inch up from the bottom of the exterior. Then we're going to sew each side with a 3/8 inch seam. I'm sewing with a 3/8 inch seam and a stitch length of 3.0, and you want to backstitch at both ends. Then you can flip it over and go ahead and sew the other side. After sewing, we want to clip a little angle into these top corners here. Be careful not to cut through your stitching. And then we can go ahead and turn the piece right side out. I first just poke those corners out with my finger, just like this. And then I'll go ahead and take my point turner and I'll work out those corners. Now you do want to be careful when you use your point turner, because you don't want to be poking through your stitching. So very gently just work out those corners. So this is what you should have right now. And you can take your glue stick and just run a line of glue above that line, so above this line right here that you drew 3/8 of an inch up from the bottom. Just run it all the way across. Doesn't have to be real neat or anything like that. And then we're going to take the lining and use that glue to adhere the lining to the back of the exterior, or to the exterior back. It should adhere pretty well. After adhering down that lining, you can press this piece with your iron at a low heat setting, and you want to do it from the exterior side. I finished pressing mine, and now I want to mark a line 3/4 of an inch up from the bottom edge. So the mark will be coming out onto my lining piece. Just like that. Then place a row of double-sided adhesive tape along the bottom edge. And then I like to use my finger presser just to burnish that down really well. Then you're going to remove that release paper to expose the adhesive. And you want to fold this bottom edge right up to the line that you drew. Just like this. All along the length. I like to put a few clips in place just to hold everything together. It does stick fairly well to this polyester fabric that I'm using here. So this is what you should have now. With the exterior facing right side up, we want to mark a few lines. The first 2 lines are going to be marked 3 inches in from each side. I've already marked my first one here, so you just place your ruler down 3 inches in from the edge, the side edge, and make your mark. Then I'll do the same thing on this side, placing my ruler 3 inches in from the side edge and make my mark. And you do want to be using an erasable marking tool to do this. Then we want to find the center of the bottom here, and you can do that either by measuring and dividing by 2, or you can simply just fold it in half and mark it that way. So I'll just line up these side edges just like this, fold it in half, and place my mark. So here's the center mark. And now we want to mark 1.5 inches away from the center on each side of that center. So I will put my ruler right where that mark is, and I'm marking 1.5 inches on this side, and then I'll mark 1.5 inches on this side. Now you should have 3 3-inch sections marked on your exterior, and I've rearranged my clips here a little bit better to help you see the sections easier. From the left side to this mark that we marked 3 inches in from the left side, that is your first 3-inch section right there. Then over here from the right side, we marked 3 inches away from the right edge. That's your second 3-inch section. Then we marked our center, and we marked 1.5 inches away from the center mark on each side of that center mark. So that is your third 3-inch section. So now we want to stitch in between our 3-inch sections. So on the left here we have a 3-inch section, and in the center we have a 3-inch section. We want to stitch in between those two sections right here. I'm going to mark it with my pen so that you can see it a little bit easier. Then between the right and the center 3-inch sections, we have this little section right here, and we're going to stitch in this area right here. I'm top stitching between the two shorter sections, 1/4 of an inch away from the edge with a stitch length of 3.0, and I will back stitch. And I also have my edge guide attached here for that 1/4 inch seam. Now I can scoot over to that next section and stitch there. So this is what it should look like now with your stitching between the two short sections. And here's what it looks like from the opposite side. And now we can set this piece aside and work on the card slots. You should have 6 card slots cut out. 4 of them are going to be 4 1/4 inches by 2 1/4 inches, and the other 2 are going to be 4 1/4 inches by 2 1/2 inches. We're going to turn all of them over so that the wrong side is facing up. And the first thing that you want to do with each one of the card slots is measure 3/4 of an inch up from the longer edge on each one of the card slots. And I have already marked all of mine. Next, you want to place a row of double-sided adhesive tape along the long edge here, and it needs to go in this section on this side of the line. So I'll place mine down. And then I use my finger pressing tool just to burnish that down. And you want to do this to each one of your card slots. After you've placed the double-sided adhesive tape onto the card slots, remove the release paper. And then you want to fold this edge right down to the line. Then I turn it over and I burnish it down with that finger presser. And then I use a couple of clips to hold everything in place. Once you have finished preparing the card slots, we are going to top stitch 1/4 of an inch away from the folded edges. I'm top stitching 1/4 of an inch away from the folded edges, and I am using a stitch length of 3.0, and you do want to back stitch at both ends. And then I'll just slip the next one in place here and continue sewing. After top stitching, just make sure that you've caught that raw edge in your stitching. And then you can go ahead and clip them apart. Now remember, 2 of the card slots are slightly taller than the others. I want to make sure that I have everything grouped together by size because I don't want to get them confused when I'm sewing them into the card slot panel. In this step, we will prepare our ID window. You will need your 2 card slot binding pieces. These are the ones that measure 4 1/4 inches by 3/4 of an inch, and you'll need your piece of clear vinyl. The first thing that you need to do is mark a line down the center of each one of these card slot binding pieces, and those lines will be 3/8 of an inch up from the long edge, and you want to place your markings on the wrong side. Next, place a piece of double-sided adhesive tape on each side of the line on both pieces. After applying your tape, burnish it down really well. Now remove the release paper from one side of the strip. Then I'm going to take a small ruler, and I want to place this ruler 3/8 of an inch up from the bottom edge, from that bottom long straight edge, and adhere it down to the tape. Don't press it down too hard. You want to make sure that it looks nice and even. The edge of the ruler should be sitting right on that line. Then remove the release paper from the other side and take your piece of clear vinyl and butt it up to the edge of the ruler. This is going to help with your alignment when you're placing the vinyl onto the card slot strip. And just take a look at it, make sure that everything looks nice and straight. Then you'll remove the ruler and then fold the other side over onto the vinyl. And burnish it down. And then put a few clips in to hold it in place. Then you'll go ahead and adhere the next strip to the other side of the ID window in the same way. After your binding strips are attached, top stitch 1/4 of an inch away from the edge on one side of the ID window. We will not be top stitching on this side at this time. I'm top stitching 1/4 of an inch away from the edge of the binding with a stitch length of 3.0 and do back stitch. We need to mark some lines on our card slot base. That's the piece that measures 10 1/4 inches by 4 1/4 inches. We're going to mark 3 lines in from each side. From the left side, you'll mark a line that is 3/8 of an inch up from the side. The second line is 3/4 of an inch up from the side. And then this line here is 3 3/4 of an inch up from the left side. Then you're going to make the same markings from the right side. So the first marking here will be 3/8 of an inch up from the side. This one is 3/4 of an inch up from the side. And this one is 3 3/4 of an inch up from the right side. Then take your ID window and we want to clip it to this middle section right here. I'll start by lining this edge up with this line here. Get it in place, make sure that the top and bottom edges are all even, and then put a few clips in to hold it in place. After clipping the window, we're going to sew it in place along 3 sides. Across the top, down the side, and then across the bottom. When you're sewing on top of the binding, you want to be stitching 1/8 of an inch away from this edge. I'm ready to stitch the window in place, and again, we're only sewing across 3 sides. This side edge here needs to remain open. And I will be stitching 1/8 of an inch away from all of my edges, and you do want to back stitch. Then I'm going to pivot, and I'm going to stitch 1/8 of an inch away from the inner edge of the binding right here. And then I'll pivot one more time and stitch across this side. I'm ready to sew the 4 shorter card slots in place. We're going to start by sewing card slots on each side on the line that's 3/4 of an inch up from the edge. So I'm just going to place the bottom edge of the card slot on that line and put a couple of clips on each side. Make sure that this bottom edge is on that line there. And then you'll do the same thing on this side. Line the bottom edge with the line that's marked 3/4 of an inch up from that side edge and clip in place. Then we're going to sew these down 1/8 of an inch from the bottom edge here on each card slot. After we have both of those sewn into place, we can go ahead and sew the second one in exactly the same way. This one will be sewn on the line that's 3/8 of an inch in from each side edge, and we can clip these together when we're at the machine. I'm going to stitch 1/8 of an inch away from the bottom edge of that card slot, and I will back stitch at both ends. And I am using a stitch length of 3.0. Then I can flip it over and sew the card slot in on the other side. Now we can sew the second card slots into place. So once again, you're going to place the bottom edge of that card slot on the line and then clip it in place. And then we will sew them together 1/8 of an inch away from the edge of the bottom of that slot and do back stitch at both ends. Then you can go ahead and sew the second card slot on the opposite side in the same way. It's time to sew the lining into the back of the card slot panel. This is the piece that measures 10 1/4 inches wide by 4 1/4 inches high. So here's the panel. We're going to place it so that the wrong side is facing up, and then we're going to clip the lining to the back of that panel, edge to edge. I have the lining clipped in place, and now we're simply going to sew 1/8 of an inch away from each long edge. There's no need to baste the side edges, but you can if you want to. This is what it looks like from the front. Make sure that your card slots are laying nice and flat. I'm sewing 1/8 of an inch away from the edge with a stitch length of 3.0, and I will back stitch at both ends. And you can flip it around and sew the opposite side in exactly the same way. We are ready to sew the 2 taller card slots onto the card slot base. First thing that you want to do is place a row of 1/8 inch double-sided adhesive tape along the bottom edge of each one of those card slots. Make sure that you burnish it down well. Then you want to take the card slot base and mark a line 1/4 of an inch up from each one of these side edges, and I have already marked my lines here. Then remove the double-sided adhesive tape from the back of the card slot, and we want to place this edge right here on the line that we drew 1/4 of an inch up from each side, and you want to place it down so that the right side is facing up on the lining. Just place it on and burnish it in place, and then we will sew this in place 1/8 of an inch away from the bottom edge of the card slot, and place the other card slot on the opposite side in the same way. I'm sewing the first card slot in place with a stitch length of 3.0 and 1/8 of an inch away from the bottom edge of the card slot. And do back stitch. Then you can flip around to the other side and sew the other one in exactly the same way. Now we can flip the card slots over to the right side, and we're going to clip it in place. All of your card slots should be spaced 3/8 of an inch apart, so you want to go ahead and check your measurement there. Make sure that this bottom one here, is 3/8 of an inch away from the one above it, and clip in place. Then you'll prepare the other side in the same way, and we're going to baste these in place 1/8 of an inch away from the edge. I'm ready to baste the card slots in place. Before I do, I want to check my spacing. The top folded edge of this card slot needs to be 3/8 of an inch away from the top folded edge of this card slot. So I'll just check that, and my spacing looks good, so now we can go ahead and baste. And I will be basting 1/8 of an inch away from the edge with a stitch length of 3.0, and I am going to back stitch at both ends. Move over to the next side. And then I'll flip it around and baste the card slot on the opposite side in the same way. It's time to bind our card slot panel along the top and bottom edge here. First thing that you want to do is make sure that you have a nice smooth edge. Make sure that nothing is sticking above that card slot base. If it is, just trim it away. Then you need your 2 binding pieces. These are the ones that you cut out 12 inches long by 3/4 of an inch high. And then you're going to mark a line straight down the center of each one of the binding pieces. That would be 3/8 of an inch up from each of the long edges. I'm going to adhere the binding to the card slot panel using the same method that I did before. I already have my ruler set up. I just placed the 3/8 inch mark on my ruler right on the edge of that binding, and it's adhered down with the double-sided adhesive tape. And now I'm going to remove the release paper from the other side, just like this. And now I'm going to butt the card slot panel up to the edge of that ruler and adhere it down. And I'll check it and make sure that I have the placement right. And that looks good to me. So now I'm going to take the ruler away from the binding. And now I can fold the binding over to the right side of the card slot panel. And I will put some clips in to hold it in place for me. I have the binding all secured into place. Now you want to be able to make sure that when you sew from the top here that you're going to catch the binding on the other side. And I'm going to show you a little tip that will ensure that you will catch the binding on the opposite side. So if you look how I placed my clips, I have the bottom of the clip right on the bottom edge of the binding right here. If I turn this over, I can look at the bottom edge of the clip on this side, and you'll see that the bottom edge is also right here, right along this bottom edge of the binding. So now we can be sure that when we sew that binding in place, we will be catching the edges of the binding in our stitching on both sides. Now I'm going to go ahead and secure the binding on the second side off camera. I've prepared my bottom row of binding off camera, and I've trimmed the excess binding flush with the side edges of the card slap panel. We will sew the binding in place with a scant 1/4 of an inch. And a scant 1/4 of an inch is just slightly less than a full 1/4 inch. I'm sewing a scant 1/4 inch from the top edge with a stitch length of 3.0, and I will be using my seam guide and back stitching at both ends. Now we can flip the panel around and sew in the bottom binding in exactly the same way. After you sew your binding in place, just make sure the bindings was caught in the stitching on the back side. It's time to sew the card slap panel to the back of the wallet. First thing that you need to do is find the center of the back and the center of the card slap panel. And for starters, we are only going to be sewing the center panel here to the back. So you want to match up the center points and secure it with some clips. After clipping, we will sew the two sections together with a scant 1/4 inch from the exterior side of the back between this point here and this point right here. I'm sewing with a scant 1/4 of an inch from the edge with a stitch length of 3.0, and I am going to backstitch. After sewing the middle section in place, we can sew the rest of the card slap panel to the back of the wallet. One thing that I like to do is place a row of double-sided adhesive tape right along the side edges. And this is the 1/8 inch tape. And then you want to burnish it down really well. Then you'll go ahead and do the same thing on the opposite side here. Then you're going to remove that release paper. And you want to bring the side edges together. I start here in the corner. I want to make sure that my bottom edge is even and that my side edge is even. And I will adhere it to that double-sided adhesive tape all the way up the side. Just keep the edges even. And that tape, that double-sided adhesive tape, will help keep everything in place here. Then you're going to go ahead and match up the bottom edges. And then you're going to see that you're going to have some extra fabric here, and that's exactly what you want. And just clip it in place. Then you're going to do the same exact thing on the other side. Remove the release paper. Line up the bottom corner first. Adhere it in place, and then line up the two side edges. And then finish up by lining up the bottom. To sew these sections in place, we will be sewing from the card slot side of the wallet. You're going to start 3 inches in from this left edge here. So right here where I have this mark, 3 inches in from the left, you're going to sew a scant 1/4 inch away from the bottom edge. You're going to stop 1/8 of an inch away from the side edge, and then you'll pivot and stitch 1/8 of an inch away from the side edge here. You're going to go all the way up towards the top, and then you'll stop a scant 1/4 of an inch from the top, and then you're going to stitch all the way across the top. You'll pivot and stitch all the way across the top. When you get to the right side here, you're going to stop 1/8 of an inch away from the right side, pivot, sew 1/8 of an inch away from that right edge. Then when you get towards the bottom, you'll stop a scant 1/4 of an inch away from the bottom, pivot, and then sew until you get to the 3 inch marking right here and backstitch. The other thing is, you are going to have these extra sections of fabric on both sides. You want to push the extra fabric away from the presser foot so that it does not get caught in the stitching. I have that extra fabric pushed up and away from where my stitching is going to be, and now I can put this underneath my presser foot and start at that 3 inch mark. So I'm just going to drop my needle right down where that mark is, and I will backstitch. I'm sewing with a stitch length of 3.0, and along the bottom a scant 1/4 of an inch from that bottom edge. When I get to that side edge, I will stop 1/8 of an inch away from the side. And then I'm going to pivot, sew up the side edge, when I get to the top of the card slot panel, I'm going to backstitch over that area a couple of times because I want that section there to be nice and strong. Then I'll stop that scant 1/4 of an inch away from the top, pivot, and then I will stitch across the top edge. And I'm going to stop 1/8 of an inch away from that side edge again. Pivot and stitch 1/8 of an inch away from the side. And again, I am going to back stitch a few times over the top of the card slot. And when I get towards the bottom, I will pivot again and stitch in 3 inches. Again, you want to make sure that that extra fabric is pushed aside. And when I get to that 3-inch mark, I will backstitch. And here's the completed wallet. I do hope that you've enjoyed watching this video. If you do decide to make this wallet, you can post pictures of them in my Facebook group, which is Rosie and David Patterns. I would love to see you over there. And I want to sincerely thank everyone who has supported me by liking my videos and subscribing to my channel. If you're not already a subscriber, I would love to have you as one. So please like and subscribe.